Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. And you are watching The Naturalist Capitalist, and I am your host, Reed Coverdale, as always. And we've got the big four back on the show again. We've got Mike. How's it going, Mike?
I'm doing well. In Pennsylvania today.
There you go. We've got Charles back on. How's it going, Charles?
Oh, doing pretty good.
And we got Dave. How's it going, Dave?
Doing as well as expected, sir.
There you go. So we've got a whole broad range of topics we're going to talk about today, but I'm going to introduce the discussion by talking about the idea of modern monetary theory. And I think a lot of people have heard of it, but they don't really understand what it means. I admittedly have not done hours and hours and hours of research. I've watched a couple documentaries about it, watched a few videos about it, done some of my own research. What it basically is the idea that, if you really condense it, it's the idea that fiat currency works. So the market does not determine the value of money. Government and government decree of a currency and taxation are what give the dollar its value. So we don't have to ever worry about the dollar crashing. We don't have to worry about inflation as long as the government is in control of the currency, which the government is so good at controlling everything else. I don't know why we wouldn't trust them with this. So the idea is a lot of people like Stephanie Kelton, who was Bernie Sanders' economic advisor on his campaign. She was saying we are basically using modern monetary theory just in the wrong way. We're giving it to, we're giving money to corporations, giving it to Wall Street. We just need to give it to the bottom instead, and things would be fine. So that's a very hard argument to fight against if you support giving money to Wall Street and corporations, because that literally makes no sense. That's the trickle-down economics. If you boost up big business with this influx of cash, it's going to trickle down to everyone else. It doesn't happen. I mean, it's just stupid. So if you're going to fight against modern monetary theory, you better be fighting against corporate bailouts and bailing out Wall Street, all these other things. The problem with modern monetary theory is it is basically what we've been using for the last 30 years especially. And I believe the dollar has half the value it did in 1990. From the institution of the Federal Reserve in 1913, it's lost 99% of its value. But even just that tiny percentage that was left, if you look at 1990 versus now, it's worth about half. So this argument that there is no inflation or that the government is controlling inflation is completely bogus. It has no control over that part of the dollar. The other thing is, to maintain modern monetary theory, in my opinion, you also have to side with imperialism to a point, because the only reason the dollar has any value is because it is the world reserve currency. The dollar truly is worthless, basically. And if the world didn't use the petrodollar to buy oil, you would see our perceived wealth just go through the floor overnight. So that's basically what's holding the dollar up. So our coziness with Saudi Arabia, our military presence around the world, and our massive oil exportations are the only thing that really keep the dollar with any value. And these are things that the Greens and the progressives are totally against. They're totally against oil, totally against imperialism, totally against Saudi Arabia, which I'd say I am too. I mean, not necessarily oil right now, because I think we still need it, but imperialism in Saudi Arabia. But this idea that we can maintain this phony currency without, keeping these old systems in place, and without getting more and more inflation and less respect from the world markets, I don't think are very realistic. So, Charles, Mike just had to drop out there. What do you think about modern monetary theory from what you know about it?
Well, I can confidently say that I am very well versed in modern monetary theory because I've watched Jimmy Dore videos. All seriousness, no, I really I'm like you, Reed. I haven't studied a whole lot of hours of research into this, but my basic understanding of how things have value is how much of it there is. Okay. For example, cars that there are only a limited edition ever made of, so they're hard to find, right? They're much more valuable than the Ford Fiesta, which has been made countless times, right? Things that are not, that there's not as much of them, it carries more value. So the more money you print following that standard, naturally, the less value it's going to have. I've always wondered about that when I've heard this argument about modern monetary theory. And, honestly, perhaps it's because we're putting it in the wrong places that we've seen a decline. But I don't necessarily think that's why we saw a decline in the value of the dollar. I think that's why debt has gotten so out of control, because we keep pumping money into places where there's no return of investment to repay the debt. There's nothing coming out of it that funds blue collar middle class so that they have more spending money, so that we can become more of a consumer society again, so that money goes back into the government so they don't have to keep borrowing money. Okay, there's only a borrow and pump it into things that do nothing for the actual people who live right here in the United States. That's why we can't build infrastructure here, but we have to build infrastructure in Niger so that we can build a military base in Niger, but it can't be done without having surrounding infrastructure. Right. That was an article that came out about a year ago. So that's a big problem. But without a doubt, this, following everything I've ever read on how things are determined in value, at least, conventional wisdom and as we say, common sense says the more of something you have, the less valuable it is. So you can't just keep pumping out money hand over fist. That's kind of like the whole minimum wage argument to me. They always say, well, the cost of living went up. Let's just raise the minimum wage. And then all the people who produce the goods and services raise the cost of that to counterbalance what they're paying the workers, which in turn washes each other out. Now you're making more money to do the job, but you're paying more money to buy the things that you want to buy. And that's all we've seen is prices go up because of either wage growth or inflation. And when you put both together, to me, it just makes things even worse.
So, Dave, before we started recording, you, Charles, and I were talking about how the new generation doesn't understand the idea of work for a product or, the value of owning anything. It's just kind of this, this payment society they live in. They just care about paycheck to paycheck, payment to payment. They don't realize that something has value because you've worked for it. You're from a different generation than we are, where people still tend to think more that way than younger generations do. So what's your take on this whole idea of value of money, value of ownership, and just the value of the dollar in general?
Well, when you were talking about modern monetary theory, I was thinking to myself, your labor, the work that you put into something is supposed to have value. But if you're pumping money or pumping digital money, whatever you want to call it, into the system, I'll never forget watching the guy who was being interviewed by, I think it was Chris Wallace, talking about how they injected money into the system. And, Wallace persisted and said, well, how do you do that? And he said, well, and he used his finger and he said, well, we mark it up. And I sat there and I just froze. I'm like, what do you mean you mark it up? This isn't like a supermarket where, the price of, bananas is 59 cents a pound. All of a sudden it's 89 cents a pound because you mark it up. So his explanation, and he was trying, it was kind of like, hey, we're digitizing money for dummies. All right, this is how we do it. We say we had $1 billion. Now we're saying we have $1 trillion. We marked it up. So getting back to my initial point that I was starting to make was that you work for something, and that labor that you expend for 40 hours, 50 hours, how many hours, you're motivated to work a 60-hour work week because you're going to get a larger paycheck. And that paycheck is the value of what you just did.
Right.
So the thing, when Michael was talking, when everybody here was making their points, I was thinking, so my labor no longer has any real value. And this is what is killing the work ethic, because it works both ways. Because, somebody will say to you, well, this COVID thing is pretty bad. Hate to use COVID here, but I'm going to do it. And I'm afraid to go to work. And I think the government ought to send me some money until I'm not afraid to go to work. Okay, well, you're not doing anything. You're not doing anything. And I understand the government caused your problem, so there's an argument that can be made that maybe the government shouldn't have caused your problem, and that maybe, there's a legal means to recover the money that the government is depriving you of because they're not allowing you to work, but that work had value. All right? So you're asking to get value, to get reimbursed for not doing anything. And I think, and take COVID out of it, because people have been doing this for the last half century. I mean, yes, I've been around for a long time. I remember the Great Society when it started. I was 0 when that happened, but I do remember, reading some books and looking into this and saying to myself, well, this doesn't look good, because the work ethic was still kind of going up during the 1960s, and then all of a sudden it leveled. And then you saw all kinds of, like, sociology books were written after that happened, because there was so much material, how this affected this group, how this group responded to it. Some people ignored it. Some people said, I'm my own boss here and I'm going to do what I want to do with my life. Other people said, well, how can I get more of this? This seems pretty good. And that's been the argument. And it in progressive circles, people say, well, the government owes you this. They owe you that. This is the big argument, like the Jimmy Dore argument. Well, the government owes you. And right. And human rights now have filtered into this, which is really scary. As well, work is a human right, but not as much as, say, healthcare. Not as much as, say, is a living wage. And all these new definitions. And, when you turn a phrase over and over again, it becomes part of the lexicon, and people start to say it over and over again. And it takes on a life that didn't exist before. So now people walk down the street and they go, yeah, I want a living wage. Okay, define a living wage. This is the big argument. Is it $10 an hour? Is it $15 an hour? And then is your labor, is the stuff that you're doing, is Michael driving a truck, is that worth $15 an hour? Is it worth $20? I mean, it depends. His employer will decide that, not the government. The government shouldn't be in there saying, okay, I'm setting the rule here, and then everybody's going to follow that rule. And what I think is going to happen is there are going to be a lot of people that say, I can't do this anymore. I can't fund this payroll. I cannot make the payroll. And I liked doing this business, but unfortunately it's not, it's not lucrative. You're not giving normal incentives, which you're incentivizing people not to do anything. And I think it's gotten worse and worse. And now it's become where you say, well, healthcare is, yeah, I agree. People should be able to get healthcare. Okay. But when you phrase it in it's a human right, then what people start to do is become indignant rather than figuring out a way, how do we truly lower healthcare costs? And I don't know, I think, isn't this on your agenda, Reed, during this talk? You're going to talk about healthcare?
Yes.
Because that's an important topic, and there are ways to get there. Joe Jorgensen has laid out ways to get there, but when you talk to a progressive, their Medicare for all is the only way to do this, single payer rules. And I'm thinking, here we go again. Not to sound like the old guy yelling at the kids again at the front lawn, but you think to yourself, we survived as a species for a very long time without all of these edicts that have to happen now with an exclamation point, because that's always how it's worded. And you think to yourself, how did we survive this long? What did we do earlier that seemed to work where people weren't whining? I know people were busy. They weren't in their basements. They weren't playing video games. They weren't online chatting all day long. They were thinking, you know what? How can I get ahead? I want a swimming pool in my backyard. How do I get there? Well, you're going to have to work for that. Okay, I'll do it because I like that guy next door. I mean, this sounds like what, the Joneses and all that stuff, but you're motivated by what you as a person. This is individual liberty. This is the pursuit of happiness. And I think people just want instant, flavorless happiness that isn't really happiness, because you're going to rely on somebody else who's eventually going to tell you what you can and cannot have once you get to a certain point.
Right.
Guaranteed. Because that's the way it always turns out that way.
Yeah. So, Mike, since you're here with us right now, healthcare. I think that's the next subject we're going to merge into. But everything that we were just talking about summarizes why I'm a libertarian, because I think the more that the government tries to manipulate something, the less representative of what the people actually want it's going to be. So with the dollar, that is a great example. The government wants the dollar to maintain its value, but there are people even in the country who are losing faith in it. They're finding other venues of currency. So, I don't know if Mike's with us right now. This adds an interesting level to this video.
might want to default to Charles.
Yeah, I'll go to Charles instead. Charles, I believe in using the most natural way to bring costs down, the most natural way to bring about cooperation, which I don't think is through government mandate. So when it comes to healthcare, I think healthcare is so expensive because of all the controls that the government has put in place to prop it up and make it so insurance companies can profit, pharmaceutical companies can profit. Remove those barriers, remove protections for pharmaceutical companies, like intellectual property laws that protect medicine that's been around for 100 years so that other companies can't make it. So what do you think about healthcare right now? I mean, and this is going to Charles now. So.
I mean, it sucks. It's unaffordable for a lot of Americans. Like you brought up, Reed, it's been a for-profit thing where the government stepped in and they've actually made it so that they can truly just profiteer off your health, not actually do anything. Here's a big issue with the current system. Okay, the way things are structured right now, there's no incentive for our current healthcare system to find cures for anything. I find it odd that at a point in time where science was far behind what it is today, we were actually able to develop better medicine as far as treatment/cures were concerned than we do today. And really, the only thing I can seem to put together is that they've figured out, with these protections that you talked about and everything, that there's no profit in curing anyone. There's only profit in treating people. I don't want to cure you of diabetes. I just want to sell you insulin every month. I don't want to cure you of cancer. I just want to treat you with chemotherapy all the time, right? How are other countries who don't even have the wealth that we have making better advancements in medicine in some cases than we are? And the only thing I can piece together is because our current system simply just wants to make money off of people. And to make matters worse, when you've got the government who's propping them up so that they can do these sorts of things, yet at the same time also providing government care for other folks, they can just mooch that money straight from the federal government, or if you don't get government care, charge you a high price. It's absolutely preposterous. The problem with government-run healthcare, as far as we are concerned right now, if you look at other countries, I think there's an argument that could be made, but I wouldn't trust our government right now to be in charge of a healthcare program for us, and that's the problem. If I were to accept a government-run healthcare program in this country, it's got to come within a complete government overhaul, because the Democrats and the Republicans can't manage anything for us, the people. We just got away from modern monetary theory, right? And if all we needed was to print more money out to do the things we want to do, then tell me something. Why did Lyndon Johnson have to take money away from Social Security to fund Vietnam instead of just printing more money? And why has every president since then taken money from Social Security for one reason or another, mostly to fund going into war? Now, what is Social Security? It's a government program created to help blue-collar folks, right? And yet it has been completely bankrupted by the government. And why is that? Because the government doesn't use Social Security. They're going to have a nice fat pension fund when they leave office, right? So they're not going to collect Social Security, odds are. So what do you think they're going to do with a health care program that's controlled by them that probably won't impact them either? They'll misrun it. They'll run it into the ground. The people probably won't get the best out of it. You'd have to have a complete overhaul, not just institute health care and say, oh, everything's going to be okay. If you think the government runs programs or any kind of government institution like a well-oiled machine, tell me, when was the last time you ever went to the VA, the DMV, or any other government institution? Because they are all miserable. Okay, that's a huge problem. But in regards to healthcare, one thing that can truly help is to actually have real competition. And when you're going for insurance, removing those state lines that we always heard about, that opens you up to a broader market. That can truly help with things too, because when you've got people competing for business, they're actually going to compete when it comes to things like prices. When you contain everything within a state, you've only got so many options. So even though it's not a complete monopoly, it's closer to a monopoly than if you could compete nationwide. Okay. So that's really going to help things for sure. Something else that could actually help people afford things so that they wouldn't have to try to buy all these pills would be ending the war on drugs. Hint, hint, legalizing marijuana. Okay. Because how many people right now are having to go out and buy drugs to make them happy from the pharmacy? Okay, and how many commercials are we getting on television? Do you have symptoms of this, this, and this? Call your doctor about this pill, right? Which I don't like Bill Maher, but I like the way he phrased this. Bill Maher once said, used to go to your doctor so he could tell you what you needed. But if you're going to the doctor to tell him what you need, he's not a doctor, he's a drug dealer.
Yeah.
Amen.
Okay. So, and again, people don't have to go out and buy these happy pills if they were potentially able to go home and take a THC capsule, smoke a joint, or eat a pot brownie at night. It could calm their whole world down, take a lot of stress off, and they don't have to go to the pharmacy to get refills every month and pay, these big pharma companies. Right. So, again, create the competition because that's what works best.
Yeah. So, Mike, did you just park? It looks like it.
Yeah, I had to pull out of the shop. Sorry, guys.
That was good timing. So, I think Charles brought up some pretty good points there. Specifically, if you think about any market that the government has had no or minimal involvement in, the profit motive doesn't destroy it because there's possibility for competition, as Charles just pointed out. So if there's possibility for competition, you're in a free market, you're going to find the highest quality product for the lowest price, because otherwise other products get they get weeded out. But our healthcare system does not work that way because, as Ron Paul used to say, we have drug dealers who are protected by the government. You have these insurance corporations that have all these government protections that give them a monopoly on the market so that there can't be any room for improvement. So what do you think about the argument of completely removing profit motive will remove any sickness from our healthcare system? That's the problem, not the government controls. What would you say to that argument?
So I have a unique perspective on this because I was one of those kids who was diagnosed with ADD as a kid, and I was put on Ritalin in first grade. So the solution to my poor performance in school every year when I went to see the doctor was to try and raise the dose. And by my senior year of high school, I was on over 100 milligrams a day of Ritalin, and they were trying 2 different rates. And I think the way our whole system is put together is kind of backwards. Doctors are working for the insurance companies. If you go in there and you answer questions, they're going to mark on their page, okay, this work related, because then we have to charge workers' comp for it. Or is this something, that we can charge the insurance company? I think in terms of solutions, people need to be focused more on nutrition. We need to be focused more on alternative methods of care, because I learned about a school of thought called homeopathy, which is from the 1920s and 30s, and there was a concerted effort to discount the credibility of that medical care, and with the beginnings of the American Medical Association. There used to be homeopathic hospitals all over the country, and then they were kind of railroaded, and because the science is kind of how all this stuff works is kind of crazy and difficult to understand if you don't understand how all these pieces fit together. But in terms of profit motive, I still think part of the reason why healthcare is so expensive is because there are so many administrators involved in the process. There's so many people cutting a paycheck from this whole program who are not doctors, who are not actually administering care, who are not out there helping people, So that's kind of my take on it. If we could get bureaucrats out of the program, maybe people could deal with their own doctor individually, not have to pay a middleman in order to your doctor.
Yeah. So, Dave, I know my name is the Naturalist Capitalist. I think socialism can work in certain areas, and I think it can work in small, concentrated groups. So, I used to be a Christian like you are, and the church is a very socialist organization, the way it works. Everyone gives to the pot, and then the funds are dispersed as the church sees fit to charities or whatever. So I don't think it's evil or something. I just think it's highly ineffective on a large scale. So today is actually the 1-year anniversary from when I first met Tulsi Gabbard in person back in New Hampshire and joined her campaign. And she talked a lot about Australia's healthcare system and how it was a success. So there are 25 million people in Australia. In the United States, there are 330 million people. And Australia is a pretty, there are obviously different cultures in Australia, but they're a much smaller, much more similar than the United States. The United States has completely different economies all over the country. In my mind, trying to centrally plan healthcare for a country this big with this many different economies, this many different people is kind of a joke. So what do you think about that?
Wow. Well, what's good about the United States is you've got 50 laboratories where you can experiment and see what works. Massachusetts has a very top-heavy mass healthcare system. Originally designed by the one and only Mitt Romney. Right. And I hate to say this, and it doesn't thrill me to say this, but it kind of works in Massachusetts. Mass health has been a fairly successful, much like a lot of people look at, say, Social Security and go, yeah, I like Social Security. I pay into it and I, get money for the rest of my life and so forth. Needless to say, there are a lot of IOUs with Social Security right now, and it's only going to get worse as that vault's been raided so many times. So basically, that's the guy, again, doing the thing with his finger saying, yeah, we just marked it up. So, but in Massachusetts, what the people did there is they all agreed to pay higher taxes. They have a state income tax, and they pay federal income tax, and they pay healthy, and that's why it's called Taxachusetts. And people still live there, and they haven't all moved out. So, you know, again, and the other thing they have is a really good healthcare infrastructure in Massachusetts, where you've got really great hospitals and you've got really high quality doctors. So, and again, it's very techy. It's very what's that word where, you know, it's very wonky, and it's worked. And I hate to say, and I'm not saying it's 100% successful, but you mentioned that here's a test laboratory where it's worked. You can go to Sweden, same deal in Sweden, okay? The Swedes, who I often talk to because I have another channel where I have Swedish musicians on quite a bit, and they say, yeah, we're very obedient people. The government tells us to do something, we do it. That scares the crap out of me, I'm going to be honest with you. But yep. The people, and they mentioned the lockdown especially, we all locked down. We did what we were supposed to do for a couple of months. The Swedes emerged without wearing a face diaper. And I'm like, ooh, how'd you guys do that? And, you know, and I don't know, this virus is such, it's like hitting a moving target, because there's so much data out there which is contradictory. But their healthcare system in Sweden, again, they pay a lot of taxes, but they're a fairly affluent society. But it is a much smaller test model, as you mentioned, and those successes seem to be only in those smaller countries and those smaller places. It doesn't work everywhere. And I think going back to your point about socialism, I would argue that libertarianism is better in a way, because it will say, well, you have your test market here, and as a libertarian, sure, we can try this here. The libertarians aren't going to say no. In fact, the libertarians are going to be the ones that embrace trying different things and using free market solutions, maybe combined with some other ideas. And I think you have to be somewhat open-minded. Healthcare is really tricky. I do very much think, I don't know, you just kind of zoned out there, Reed. Are you still there on my end? Or did I drop out? Okay.
The computer decided to restart.
So I'll keep going while this will be easy for me and Michael and Charles. So yeah, I don't know. I don't have the one answer to the whole healthcare dilemma, because it's really complicated. And Charles, you talked about insurance companies, and they get it. You know, it's like everybody gets a cut. You know, and by the time everybody gets their cut, it's like healthcare is really expensive. And if it was me, say if I showed up at the doctor and I said, "Hey doc, I get $500. What can I do for $500? That money's going to go directly to you. There's no administrators. There's no overhead. What, you know, tell me." And he's going to say, "I'll take your $500, and we'll do the surgery, and we'll do the checkup. We'll do whatever it is that the doctor needs to do." And there's no, I guarantee you, the doctor and the patient, if they had a relationship, and I've seen this in other places, this has been tried, I believe in the state of Kansas, there's a doctor who has basically said, "Hey, come directly to me. I'm the healthcare provider, in addition to being the doctor. And you want to reduce costs quickly? Eliminate all of that in-between nonsense, the paper pushing, the insurance companies. Eliminate that. And of course, you know, sign your waivers, sign your disclaimers. But I guarantee you're going to get healthcare at a much lower cost." Yeah. Charles, Mike, you got anything to say?
I agree.
Yeah. Still lost. Reed is still frozen.
Yeah. Although I don't know how he's recording the call if his computer.
It still says on my end, Reed is recording.
Here he comes.
Oh, wait a minute.
There he is, upside down.
This has got to be one of the funniest live streams we've all ever done.
Yeah, luckily it isn't live. I'm on my phone right now, obviously. I don't know how long my computer's going to take to reload. Does it say I'm still recording?
It does.
Oh, wow.
You're recording the call, but I have no idea how that actually works.
We just kept going.
Yeah,
Us.
my computer just died for some reason, so.
So just to update you, I did answer your question completely, and I deferred to Charles and Michael for a little more perspective, and they were gracious enough to fill in the time. So
I'm proud of you guys.
Thanks.
So were you guys still talking when I came back on, or what?
Yeah, we were kind of finishing up on the idea that healthcare is kind of tricky. It's not, no matter what you say about it, the libertarian perspective or doing socialistic, whatever you want to call that, healthcare. I do believe that you made a good point at the beginning, and I kind of agreed with it. Massachusetts and Sweden, and there are probably a few other examples where they're able to do this, and then people go, okay, let's do it everywhere. And I'm thinking, maybe not. Maybe you do your own little experiment in your state. The 10th Amendment here kind of applies. Do your thing, do your test laboratory, and then report back with the results. And, if it works, and maybe some other states want to do it.
Right. All right. Well, since I'm back, I guess the thing we'll talk about is COVID-19 is probably a good transition from healthcare. So there's a few different things we can talk about. I'll just say that with COVID-19, I admittedly haven't done a ton of research into how it could have started, all the alternate theories about what it is, all that. What I do know is I've got a cousin who's in the healthcare system. He works in the emergency room. I have actually I got 3 cousins who work in the emergency room, and they all say this is a serious disease. It is, it is more deadly than the flu. It affects people more than, it affects people worse than the flu would. But there's been a ton of different information coming out. I did read that article about the CDC saying, 6% of the cases were solely from 6% of the deaths were solely from the coronavirus. So I don't really have a hard line opinion on this, but Dave, I know that you do. So why don't you think about what's going on?
Yeah. And I want Charles and Michael to have a chance to speak, so I'm going to try to be brief here.
There you go.
I'm just throwing that out there right now, so you know where I'm at. And I understand. My wife works as a medical assistant, so when I give you that as something, and I know, Reed, you've said you've got cousins and they're EMTs or they're in the emergency room. My wife went out the first 2 weeks in March, and they changed her. They basically changed her job. She went from just basically checking in patients and to going and swabbing COVID patients. And I got to tell you, as her husband and as somebody who cares about my wife, I was really on edge. I mean, she'd bring this stuff into the house, and I got 3 kids and obviously myself. So, my wife is also into essential oils, and I don't want to go into a commercial for that kind of thing, but we have a little side business that we do here. And, she just beefed up on the zinc and a lot of things, by the way, which people aren't really allowed to talk about anymore, which I think is really, really bad. Whether you think COVID is a hoax or you think it is a full-blown hysteria, the fact that information is being like prevented. I mean, if I go on Twitter and I put, hey, hydroxychloroquine, it might actually work. Censored. What? So whether you're a medical geek and I'm I'm reading a couple of books on top of it because this subject really intrigues me for some reason. And what I'm learning is that the COVID virus is something that's very similar to things that we've had in the past. Now, as far as the infection rate and the severity of it, if you did the old bell curve thing at the beginning, in March and April, that was a pretty steep upward climb. I'm not going to, especially we have folks here in Florida that went up to New York City, and there were refrigerator trucks that were available for bodies, okay? So I'm not saying that it was a minor deal, but I will say this. It was very regional. If you look at the map, you look at New York, New Jersey, we have hot spots supposedly here in Florida, nothing like New York and New Jersey. I think New York accounts for about 50%, close 40 in the 40s, and then New Jersey adds another 20 or 30. Both of those governors now are under investigation, though, for sending COVID patients to nursing homes. And that is a DOJ thing. That is a big deal. So I don't know. Probably nothing is going to come of that, to be honest with you, just based on what I've seen and the way the wheels of justice here aren't moving at all. But I could say this about COVID-19. I mean, it's up to you what you want to do with your health. Typically, the report you cited with the 6%, and now there's so much pushback on that report. It's hysterical to watch. Well, but those 94% of the people that had other comorbidities and so forth, and they had asthma, and they had diabetes, and they had heart disease, and it was caused by the COVID. No, it wasn't. It wasn't. And the average age, let's be honest, and if you look at pretty much every state, the average age is, let's just say this, it's senior citizen plus for the most part. I'm not saying people under 60 or 50 don't die from this. Again, if you're living a very unhealthy lifestyle, you are born genetically deficient, you have an immune deficiency for some reason, this has affected a lot of people maybe that should have lived a better lifestyle, okay? And we're all somewhat guilty. I'm guilty of this. I could lose, 20 or 30 pounds easily, and I worry. And I'm thinking to myself, what am I going to do? I should probably work out. I should probably run, exercise. So, just to address the COVID thing as a general issue, I would say the media has definitely played a heavy-handedness in this, in perpetuating fear, okay? And if you're a libertarian, you should be concerned more about your civil rights, right, about the government showing up at your house to do contact tracing randomly. We know that our friend Tulsi Gabbard was part of a bill, which is a heinous thing, and I don't understand it. And if you're into like end times prophecy, the name of the bill had 4 6s on it, and you would be like, are you serious? Are you making this up? Are you telling me that the bill is actually 6666? And then the armored vehicle shows up in front of your house, and I'm being a little dramatic here for effect, and they jump out. And I had a guy in my neighborhood, by the way, with a clipboard running around, and I'm in a gated community, and he had a clipboard, and I heard him next door talking about COVID-19. Needless to say, I didn't answer the door when he rang the doorbell. I didn't want him to know. And I've told my children, I say, if anybody wants to do a COVID-19 test on you randomly, do not consent to that test, all right? If you've got crazy symptoms and you're sneezing, coughing, hacking up a lung, okay, we'll bring you to the doctor, all right, ourselves, and we'll have the doctor refer you out if you need a test, or he'll do the test, all right? What I'm worried about with COVID-19 is it's just going to be another loss of our freedoms, because they're going to use this information to do other things. And how many times, what could go wrong, right? It's not like Edward Snowden didn't warn us, and it's not like Julian Assange didn't warn us. Right. If we're truly concerned about civil liberties, we should be really crazy worried about what they're doing with COVID-19 information. And that's all I got. And the health information and the crisis, and is this worse than the flu? Is it's bad, but again, I think we've all lived through things before that we didn't know about, and this didn't happen. And maybe I lived through it, you guys didn't because I'm older. But I guarantee you, whether it was swine flu, whether it was the SARS first round, because this is a SARS virus, by the way, it's the same kind of thing. We lived through it. We didn't shut the economy down. So this is where you get some of the crazy conspiracy theories that are out there that I don't necessarily sign on to 100%, but I definitely think there might be some truth buried in some of that information. I think people really just be careful. Don't just go along with everything that the government is telling you here.
Right. Yeah, Mike, I've noticed from the right and the left during this time, we have two crises going on that I think are way overblown. So one is the coronavirus, the other one is the riots, and they're both problems. But I feel like a lot of people on the right are getting so scared of these riots that they want to forfeit our civil liberties to put them down. So they want to call the army in. They want to trace people without due process. They want to arrest people without due process. But then on the left, we've got the same amount of authoritarianism over this virus. They want to forfeit our rights to, they want to track us. They want our records. They're calling the police on us if we have more than 10 people in a gathering. And I'm a libertarian, so I'm against both of those things. I think signing on to authoritarianism in the wake of fear is how pretty much every bad thing in history has ever happened. So what do you think specifically about COVID with the amount of authoritarianism we're giving into? Do you think that the government is going to let go of whatever power it takes during the crisis?
Boy, it's one of those slippery slopes, isn't it? It's a funny thing, growing up in this country, learning about, how we're supposedly a free country and we're supposed to have our own autonomy and our ability to make our own decisions. I feel like in the spirit of that, having laws on the books where, if if I want to wear a mask and it's completely voluntary, fine. If you feel like it makes you safer, the research really hasn't been done on that. A line is crossed when the government comes out and says, "Oh, by the way, if you don't wear a mask, that's a fine. That's potential jail time. That we're gonna give you a ticket." And that's the line, and I think that's really where the line needs to be drawn. Is to say, okay, yes, we cross the line when we say, okay, no, you know what, we're going to enforce this. Well, there are certain populations out there who shouldn't wear a mask because they have asthma, they have a hard time breathing. Maybe there should be some gray area for this stuff instead of being hard and fast with these laws. Saying, okay, yeah, everybody has to wear a mask all the time, and if you're not, that's a fine or jail time, or that there's some real dicey implications that have been crossed, and no one seems to be calling them out on it. We really should. That's where us libertarians seem to have the right idea, being like, it's my body. If I want to wear a mask, fine.
Yeah. So, Charles, I don't know what your position was on this, but a few years ago, there was the bake the cake incident. I'm assuming you know what I'm referring to. And I believe the store owner should have had the right to refuse service. I think store owners should have that right in pretty much any case. So I'm consistent with that. I also think they should be allowed to require you to wear a mask. And if you're not going to wear a mask, you shouldn't be allowed to go into a store. I think the private sector, individual businesses, individuals in general are going to be better at figuring out how to deal with this than a government mandate. What's your response to that?
I agree. It should really come down to if the business wants you to wear it, great. If they decide they don't want you to wear it inside their establishment, they should be allowed to decide that too. Here's the biggest thing that has stood out to me in recent time. Early on, I heard the whole COVID thing, and I said, okay, this is something we should probably take serious. I expected it to blow over in maybe a couple of months. It hasn't. And as things just keep on with no end in sight, some things have come to my attention that make me ask a lot of questions. The main one is tuberculosis. Now, tuberculosis last year infected 10 million people. It killed, worldwide, 1.5 million people. Okay? How does tuberculosis spread? Airborne droplets. Sound familiar yet? Sounds like COVID, right? Spreads by airborne droplets. 10 million people infected, 1.5 million dead. Why were we not wearing a mask?
Yeah.
See, I watched a video where someone brought that very question up, and I said, you know what? That's a pretty darn good question. Why weren't we wearing a mask? And his response in the video was because the mainstream media didn't tell you to wear a mask. Wow. How can you argue with that, right? More importantly, what he also brought up, since we're the libertarians here and we're talking about our civil liberties, and David brought up what Snowden warned us about. Ironically enough, in that very same video, this guy also mentioned that they've got the cameras now that are testing facial recognition. They're trying to test out how well they work on partial facial recognition. They're trying to test out how well they work. Who buys the propaganda versus who doesn't, right? Who can we indoctrinate with these messages versus who's not taking the bait? Yeah. And the social distancing factor. Well, one, we're wearing masks now, right? So why do we need to stay 6 feet apart if these masks are stopping the spread? The other thing about the facial recognition, they work better when you're more spread apart and you're not on top of each other because there's too many faces to try to pick up. It's awful coincidental. When you look at the things that we've had in the past, and we've got another illness out there that's affecting potentially more people than COVID, not necessarily in the United States, but worldwide, and has killed more people than COVID, and yet we're handling this with such a fear like we don't do for anything else. And to me, I think here's what really stood out to me the most, okay? Worldwide, tuberculosis is one of the top 10 causes of death and the leading cause from a single infectious agent above HIV and AIDS. And yet we make no pandemic out of it whatsoever. So since the origins of COVID-19, I really shifted a lot. And now I fully believe that at this point, there is a lot of hysteria. And yes, you can cite, okay, well, we've had celebrities die and this and that. I mean, you've had Herman Cain, you had the country music star Joe Diffie. Okay, you've had all these deaths, but they were also elderly people. They're going to be really susceptible to any kind of flu or anything that they might contract, right? So that being said, I honestly, I don't know if this is the case or not, but I'm far more skeptical at this point that this was really all a big plan to see how well they could control the population, who the propaganda works on, and how well our spying technology can truly work. I fully kind of, I'm more down that path at this point.
Yep.
Yeah, so this will lead us into our last discussion. I want to talk about education because as we were talking before we started recording, my dad is a high school English teacher, and he used to teach philosophy in class. But what he realized was nobody cared about consistency of their philosophy. You could back them into a corner and say, you can't believe both of these things at the same time, and they wouldn't care. They'd be, so what? So, you'd read the book 1984, which I read when I was in his class, and read the book Brave New World. Both of those books have eerie similarities to what's going on today, but most kids who read it, they didn't even care. It's just about passing a test. I read the chapter. I know what happened in the chapter. There's no conceptualizing anymore. It's not about what do you learn. It's about what test can I pass. And I think that's been reinforced through policies like No Child Left Behind. All these things that are just about making you pass standardized tests instead of learning. And I think the Department of Education has actually been what has really gutted our middle class, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Because what you have is a department that has kids from a young age that forces them into thinking that they need, in order to be successful, they have to go to college, they have to own a big house, they have to own a nice car, they have to do all these things in order to be a successful American. And there's very little that teaches you about responsible financing, about buying things you can afford. It's just about getting the degree, getting the car, getting the house. There's nothing that's teaching you to, get married once you know what you want to do, not go to college until you know what you want to do. It's all just about go, go, go. And so then once they're out of school, they go to college and they instantly get in debt. And as we were saying before this recording, a lot of kids don't have any concept of owning something. Their parents get them a car that, they bought, and the kid doesn't have. A lot of times the kid's not even paying insurance or paying for gas or anything. It's just something he gets and he uses. And then, so then he goes to college, and then he ends up 60 grand in debt. So this idea of 60 grand in debt is just dead to him. It doesn't matter. It's what is my payment every month? Can I fit a car in here too? Can I fit a house payment in here too? Can I fit whatever? And they just pile on until they're a couple $100,000 in debt sometimes for most of their lives. And that's why they don't care about things like our federal debt. That's why monetary policy is completely dead to them. And it all traces back to the Department of Education. So, in my mind, the Department of Education and the corporations are probably, and the banks, that if there isn't a spoken agreement, there's at least a non-spoken agreement that they are each other's buddies, because they can fuel this debt-based economy that we have with a bunch of wage slaves who can't ever get out of their 9 to 5 job that they had because they failed getting a job for their degree, and they just work low-wage jobs with a bunch of payments for their whole lives. And who does it benefit? All these payments and everything. It benefits the banks. It benefits the businesses that get to sell products because the government backs all of these loans. They don't have anything to worry about. So it's almost like just a giant Ponzi scheme. So Charles, you're young like me. You just came out of high school not too many years ago. So what do you think about that? Is that an accurate assessment of what's going on?
Oh, without a doubt. People today do not have an appreciation. We got a society from, say, around the 80s or so, okay, where people kind of got a little bit of money, kind of got ahead, okay. If you listen to some people who talked about the stock market, for example, Robert Kiyosaki was one of the guys, and he said if you didn't make a lot of money in the stock market during that time, it was pretty much kind of your own fault. People were able to make a good bit of money, and they've passed it down to their kids, and the kids have become kind of spoiled in today's world, right? They didn't pass down that hard work, and it's going to make you pay off, by only working hard. That's how you get somewhere in life, okay? Give you a good story about that. I got a brother-in-law, and to his credit, he's doing a lot better today, okay? He's doing a lot better today than he was when me and my wife first started dating. But man, oh man, was this kid spoiled, okay? His mama spoiled him really, really badly. And partially, unfortunately, family tragedy, lost his father at a young age. So the father wasn't there during those teenage years in a lot of ways. He only had the mom, right? And the mom pampered him and spoiled him to no end, okay? You know how many cars I've ever totaled since I've been driving? And in my world where, at one point I was working the 3 jobs and at one point 2 jobs, I have totaled 0 cars. He has totaled 2. Once, for driving so late, he fell asleep behind the wheel, crossed a double yellow line in the center of the road, and hit a car head on when he had a restricted license and wasn't even supposed to be driving after dark. The next was because, again, he was coming home from work so late he fell asleep behind the car, went off the road, hit a telephone pole, and rolled the car twice. Okay? Not a lot of responsibility here. You know why? Because mama always bought him a new one. The other thing is, he had such a bad problem at one point. He was so addicted to video games, and mama enabled him to be addicted to these video games to the point he would go for days without baths. Okay? Now, I went to New Orleans, and I encountered a lot of homeless people while I was there. There was a certain odor that I smelled. What struck me worse was that it almost smelled like his room. That's how bad things were, okay? So in other words, there's too many young people in society, and my wife could be hearing me, so I could get cussed out when I leave this video. But the point being is, there's too many young people who've had it too easy. And this education system has put them in this frame of mind. Like you said, Reed, it told them these are the things that you have to have, but it never really taught them how you get them. And unfortunately, the education system has failed to teach our young people that. And in a lot of cases, parents have failed to teach the young people that as well. In a lot of cases, we've got, and it's not getting any better. Unfortunately, we've got people who are not ready for kids, having kids, then not really knowing how to teach them and raise them as they grow. And then they go off into an education system, which also doesn't teach them how to be responsible adults once they leave senior year. Then they get out there in the real world. They do what the education system told them to do, which was go to college, get all this sorts of funding and whatnot. And then you're going to become successful. And as we've said in these videos in the past, 9 times out of 10, that doesn't happen. But then again, because of how they've been brought up, how spoiled they were, I'll deflect back to my brother-in-law here. He actually went to college and he got government funding to go to college, but he didn't put the effort into doing anything with college. It got boring. It interfered with video game time. He woke up late, didn't make it into class. So here's what started happening. He told mama, he said, okay, I want to drop out. So they called the school for him to drop out. You know what they told him? You can't. You got government funding to come here. If you want to drop out, you've got to repay this money to us because some other kid who might have been serious about their education system wanted that chance and didn't get it. We gave it to you. So you either got to pay it back or go to school. So you know what he did? He just quit going to school, period. He didn't drop out. He just quit going to class. Now, I want you to think about that. That's government money. The government's funding this whole thing, right? The government's funding this so he could get an education system, but because of lack of responsibility being taught here, okay, he squandered it, and that money went completely to pot. So that's a huge problem with the way the government is funding all these colleges where you're going to, by the way, go there, and even if you've got one job career in mind, they're going to make you take things that don't even pertain to it so they can charge even more money. That's why my mother-in-law went to school for accounting, but wound up having to take a class on astrology because there's other classes that you had to take, right? And then high school, when I was there, you could take a personal finance class, but it was what was called electives. Now, electives were classes that you could choose to take, but they were not required. In other words, personal finance was in the same category as, I don't know, baking. So they prioritize you being able to take a class on making a budget for your everyday life as at the same priority as how to bake a cake. Okay? There's no more precedence one over the other. But what they require you to take is English all the way through 12th grade. You've got to read all this ancient literature. You've got to read, about the Odyssey, and you've got to read of mice and men, and you've got to read Shakespeare. Then you've also got to go to a science class where you learn how to dissect a frog. You learn about all these chemicals. Then you'll take a math class where you're studying algebra, geometry, possibly even trig. Depends how far along you go and how smart you were. But they're not mandating that you take classes that might help you in the real world, teach you some responsibility. Furthermore than that, they've got trade schools that are associating with a lot of these high schools. And yet, instead of investing more funding into that so that you could learn a trade and actually get a job making decent money without having to go for that 4-year liberal arts degree that 9 times out of 10 doesn't pay for itself at the end and only puts you into debt. Instead, those are also electives. Again, classified at the same priority as, say, play, drama, music, choir, band practice. All these things are put at the same level in our education system, and not one is more prioritized than the other. They are electives. This is something that could teach you carpentry, machine tool, welding. You could make blueprints, maps with a drafting class, right? You could learn how to do computers, computer programming, all these different things. It's electives. It's only if you want to take it. And the education system isn't really telling you, no, this is something you need to be taking unless you really do have aspirations on becoming a lawyer. But understand that's a much longer road. So if you want to make good money, here's an option for you. You got to work for it, but this is an option. You don't have to go to college. They won't invest in things like that. They make it harder to get into these classes. And as a result, we've got people who were conditioned by our current education system to think this is how I'm going to become successful. Then they got in the real world after being spoiled at home and misinformed in school. They got into the real world and figured out, oh, things didn't work out the way they said it was going to. Here I am with a mountain full of debt, waiting tables or working at the fast food restaurant, and I don't know how to repay this, and I can't make ends meet. So the government needs to help me out here. Society needs to take care of my problems. That's where all this, in my opinion, has accumulated from. And so without a doubt, we need a complete overhaul in this country. But also our young folks have to wake up and realize the difference between the real world and the utopia that our education system led you to believe is out there. It's not out there. And you're not going to be able to make it happen either. That's why it's called a utopia. It's reality, reality versus fantasy here. Okay? You've got to work to have things in life, or they mean nothing to you. And just like with my brother-in-law, for example, because mama never cracked down and make him work for things, even still to this day, he doesn't pay his entire car insurance. And after his driving record, it's terrible. Okay, he pays about as much for one vehicle as me and my wife pay for the 4 of ours. Okay, and we're still both below that 25-year-old threshold, so ours isn't cheap either. But that being said, when you don't have to work for things, you don't get an appreciation on it. And I'll wrap it up with this. Even with big tech, it amazes me how some of the old folks that I grew up around, who a lot of people would look at today and say, oh, they were old, uneducated. They were very wise. Maybe not when it come to books. They may not know algebra, but they had a common sense that was complete wisdom when they said that all the technology would be the downfall of society because people did not use it correctly. And with Google, internet, and social media, instead of educating ourselves, we've turned it into a crutch so that we can get the answers at a moment's notice without having to read books, without having to study. And you never retain the information 9 times out of 10. You just look it up, get it, and say, oh, that's great. And then you go about your way and you never think about it again. And that has also contributed in a lot of ways to our young folks because they're not studying. They're just looking, going on, because they want to get back to playing Call of Duty or whatever else. And there's a massive change, not just from our government level, in my opinion, but at our societal level and in our education system that's going to have to happen if we ever want to get back to being a country where we are the standard leading the world. That's why our education's fallen to 27th and we used to be number 1. And if we ever want to get back to that point, we've got to really self-examine what our own problems are personally, parentally, and in the education system, and really start making some changes, or we're never going to get that improvement.
Yeah, I agree. So, Mike, I'm going to talk to you about the problems in the system, and then I'll go to you afterward, Dave, and we'll talk about the problems in society. So, Mike, I think we need to completely dismantle the Department of Education, completely get rid of student loans. And, a lot of people hear that and it sounds evil to them. I mean, it sounds like, what? You don't want to educate our children? But as we've kind of laid out here, this is a nefarious system that has destroyed our middle class. It's made us not think. It's just been terrible. So, I mean, we've just got to get rid of it. I know you think the same way I do economically. What would the right structure look like to you? Would it just leave it to the states? And do you agree with the problem? Do we just have to dismantle this top-down system we have?
Yeah, I have some interesting thoughts. Charles mentioned Robert Kiyosaki. He's one of the people who opened my eyes early on in my life, learning how some of the things they taught you in school really weren't all that helpful.
Right.
I was privileged enough to take a few finance classes when I got to college, and after learning about what time value of money is and how it works, and realizing that they're not teaching these kids in high school before they actually go out and take $400,000 worth of debt, and then have to spend the next 30 years of their life paying that back because of compound interest. If you knew what the deal was when you were getting it and doing the math, you probably wouldn't take that whole career,
Yeah.
So, I think we are really doing our kids a disservice by pressuring them to go to college, to take out mountains of debt. I think, I've listened to, like, Larry Sharp talk about, maybe 12 years is too many for high school. Maybe we should cut them off at 10 and give them an option to say, okay, the last 2 years, go learn a trade. Then you can go out and become a plumber or an electrician or something that's actually going to pay your bills instead of just going and spending 4 years at a college, getting done, having a mountain of debt, and not a clue what you're going to do for And yeah, we should probably get rid of the Department of Education because, what do they really do? They're just up there. I mean, it's the same argument as it is with healthcare. There'd be a whole lot more money to pay teachers if we weren't paying all these bureaucrats and administrators and bean counters who give out the money all the time.
Right. Yeah. So, Dave, as I said when I first started this subject, my dad's an English teacher. He's taught these books. The concepts of what is going on through government control, through lack of absolute truth, through consistency in your argument. How do we get back to that as a society? Because it's easy to go from being a principled society to where we are. It seems like a much harder stretch to get us back to where we were. And I don't know, for people who don't think, it's much easier to not have to form a cogent argument, to not have to form a system of morality that makes sense, because it doesn't matter. You can just do whatever you want. There is no truth. There is no right and wrong. That's kind of where we are today. Yeah. How do we convince people that it does matter if your ideas make sense? I mean, because it seems like the system's just going to fall apart pretty soon, because when you have a few people who think that there is no truth or you don't need to work or whatever. The majority can carry the system through, but we're getting to the point where the majority is going to be the idiots and they're going to be running everything, and we're kind of already there. So how do we go back to where we were, or at least like try to head in that direction?
Yeah, well, I know, Reed, that you're an atheist. I remember you telling me that you were a Christian, you're an atheist, and I'm not saying. By the way, I'm preface this. I don't think all atheists have like zero morality or anything like that. So I want to put that out there first of all. But whether you believe in Christianity or Judaism or Islam or whatever I would argue strongly that Christianity, of all the faiths, has probably done the most to instill some type of template, in whether you disagree with the outcome of that template, or I hear people talking about the fairy god in the sky and so forth, and that's goofy that you would believe in something. I've actually heard professors come out and say things like, well, we've debunked Christianity, so now we have to invent a new fable so people will decide to follow that fable and behave a certain way. Right. It's almost like, well, that fable, if you believe that it's a fable, wasn't good enough to bring people to some kind of understanding of right and wrong. Intrinsically, the way the Christian faith works is that, if you believe in a hardcore version of Christianity, where you're pretty much a failed loser and you need Christ in order to make you something, that is actually a good perspective, believe it or not, because you realize your own sort of fallible nature, and you say to yourself, well, I am kind of a loser, and without faith in God, and God's going to carry me through, and it's something. It may not be for everyone, and I'm not advocating here. This isn't a message to try to convert people to Christianity, but you really kind of teed that ball up for me, and I'm like, am I going to do this? And I said, yeah, I'm going to do it. Yeah. The reason I decided to do it is because you look around and nobody seems to have any kind of compass. They're all, because, and then if you say this stuff out loud, they go, dude, you're just, you go pray to your fairy god and do your weird things and fall down on the ground and worship this imaginary being and so forth. I don't know how to invent that other than to say, maybe open a Bible for the reason of you can garner some wisdom. Read the Proverbs. Read it from a secular perspective. If you don't work, the Bible says if you don't work, you're not going to eat. Pretty simple concept. Now, it doesn't have to necessarily be just a Christian concept to understand that that's what that means. You can read other books. There are plenty of other great philosophers out there to read and to understand, and maybe that will bring you someplace other than just it's me, it's me, it's me. We've really created a generation of people that are insecure. They don't have self-confidence. They're very self-aware, however, which is weird because they're very kind of confident in they're not confident in the right things. They're almost like saying, well, look at me, I'm over here. Pay attention to me, I'm over here. But there's really, the emperor has no clothes. There's nothing to see over there. So we're creating a whole generation of people who have this self-awareness, but they don't have any kind of substantive, meaning in their life. So they then start to blame people for their problems because they're not well adjusted and they don't have any moral grounding. Now, you might approach this Reed different than I would. I would probably refer them to a church, at least a grounded church, and not one of these circus churches that are out there right now that are just basically saying, hey, do whatever you want to do, and we're here for you, and if you fail, it's okay. To a certain extent, you have to eventually push people out to the wolves a little bit, maybe over to Charles because he's got a podcast, and maybe they'll hear some common sense, some old school Southern hit you on the head proverbs and metaphors, as we like to say about Charles, Because Charles will dispense advice, and he'll say, you know what? If you don't work, you're not going to eat. You know what? If you want that new car, you're going to have to work your ass off for it. You can't just hang out and do nothing and expect people to bring you things. But you've got the media, you've got the video game industry, you've got magazines, you've got whatever else is up. Basically, people are on a screen most of their life now. And I'm guilty of some of this because I want to see the car wreck. So I tune in, I go on Twitter, and I see, okay, here's the car wreck today. And I have to eventually pull myself away from that. So there are a number of disciplines, whether you're a religious person, a Christian, or a non-Christian, that, books, hey, son, I know you've been on this video game today for like 7 hours. I don't know if this is good for your health. Maybe you ought to go outside, ride your bike around, do something. And as far as what the others were talking about, I 100% agree with the fact that we need to teach trades. There's nothing shameful about being a plumber or an electrician. Or down here in Florida, we could use an HVAC tech right about now. September down here where I live, it's like an inferno. It's like, it's just insane, and people's ACs are going out like every 5 seconds where I live. So you would think it would be a lucrative profession, and nothing to discourage, but high school, college, none of the current template or paradigm right now is adequate to meet the needs of our society. Because for the last 2 generations, I would say, probably since 1980 or so, we've been teaching kids or telling kids that, hey, you got to go to college. You're not going to make anything of yourself if you don't go to college. And then so the kids go through a very perfunctory, like teach to the test. And again, this right there in the Department of Education, because that's what they do. They design these things where, we'll teach you how to ace this test and then go on to do nothing in your life. And it's horrifying because you could see it's like in slow motion. Why doesn't Johnny have a good job? He aced his test. Well, that's all he knows. And by the way, full confession, I did not use high school algebra in my life until I was 37 years old. I used it one time. I used it once, and I was like, holy crap, this is algebra. What do I do? And I kind of remembered how to do it, and I got the equation right. I'm like, yes, I used it. But none of the jobs I ever applied for required, I would say 90% of what I learned in high school. And then I went on to college, and I took business classes, and, you had to write papers, and, you had to comment on theories and then write your thesis to that. It was so boring. It was so uninspiring. I could have been working for 4 years. I could have been doing something. I wanted to do radio broadcasting anyway, so I was just hanging out at the college radio station. So it didn't, none of it made any sense. But I think you do what you're inspired to do. And, I heard a commentator a long time ago say, do what you're passionate about, and eventually the money will show up. Because you're going to be so interested in what that thing is that you're going to want people to teach you. You're going to want to be an apprentice. You're going to want your attention span won't be like, oh, I got to sit here through this damn class and get through it. No, you'll be inspired, and then at the end of it, you'll be what you really want to be. Or you could take a more pragmatic approach and say, you know what? There are no HVAC technicians here. I want to be one of those because I want to have the house on the beach. I want to have the car. I want to have these things. I want to have a decent life. And there's nothing wrong, by the way. That's pursuing happiness. That's what you want. So we're failing. Like Department of Education, even before any of my various pursuits, whether it was looking at the Green Party, looking at anything else, the Department of Education is a beast. It doesn't deserve funding. It's one area that's easy to just chop out. But man, oh man, you want to talk about pushback with teachers' unions and even locally, at the local level here in Florida. You push back on these teachers who, by the way, don't want to go back to class because of COVID. They're dead set against teaching the kids. They don't want to go. They want virtual learning, which is even worse if that's possible. It's even worse than in-person learning just because of the content and how there's no sort of interaction and there's no curiosity. It's like, okay, here's an equation, you figure it out, we'll give you, 5. I don't know. You're better off homeschooling your kids at that point, or forming your own little micro school. Get like 10 families together, get a bunch of families together and form your own school, do it yourself. And this is what America has always been, but we are about 50 years removed from that paradigm, if not more. And Reed, I don't know. It's a long road. As a libertarian, as somebody who is a recent convert to libertarianism and sort of the do-it-yourself mentality and understanding that you own yourself, is a lot of hard convincing to do, and that's going to be up to the better communicators and the smart people among us to persuade, and we got a lot of persuading to do.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I want to thank everyone for watching. I'm going to try to make something out of that through editing. We had a lot of technical errors, but I'll have a link in the description to everyone's Twitter page and YouTube channel, and I hope everyone checks in on the next episode. So I'll just give you each a few seconds to close out. Dave, what's your last thing to say on this?
I love you guys. This is a great show. You'll learn stuff. If you're not a libertarian, it doesn't matter. This is independent, both in content, in the sense that it's not left or right necessarily. It's just good, and you should just open yourselves up to different things, and don't just close off because Reed says he's a libertarian or I think I'm libertarian. We're all just people just trying to figure this out. So that's my close.
Yeah, I actually officially became a libertarian on Tuesday. I was not registered, but I'm a registered libertarian now.
Congrats.
Mike, what do you got to say just to close out?
Well, it's been an interesting conversation, and I really like it going, and I think we need to keep talking. That's really what we're learning here is, maybe there are solutions to these problems that are staring us in the face and nobody knows how to deal with them. So, yeah.
Yeah, listen to this, everyone. All right, Charles, what you got for us? Any metaphors? We haven't heard one yet in this show. So.
By the time this video finally hits YouTube, there may be more edits and jumps than a Joe Biden thought pattern, but one thing is for sure. We at least have good content, whereas most of his thoughts are nothing but garbage. So that being said, we've had a good conversation. We've educated a lot of folks, and hopefully somebody's going to take something away from this, and we're going to get more people to come out and actually vote for a good presidential candidate in November, Joe Jorgensen 2020.
There you go.
There you go. All right, guys, we will catch you all on the next show.